We want to look at the Mundell-Fleming model, which is an open economy version of the ISLM model. So we have the ISLM, but along with that, we also have the uncovered interest parity condition and the net export function. The focus here is to determine output, interest rate, and exchange rate in an open economy in the short term. So let's look at the first main element of the model, which is the IS curve for an open economy. Now, when we're looking at the IS curve in open economy, now we'll define our aggregate demand to also include net exports. Initially, when we were looking at a closed economy, our aggregate demand, which is demand for domestically produced goods and services, was Z is equal to C plus I plus G. But now this will also include net exports. So when we add net exports to the model, our IS curve equation, which was initially represented by the goods market equilibrium condition as y is equal to c plus I plus g in a closed economy, is now replaced by y is equal to c plus I plus g plus net exports, right? So the difference over here is that in a closed economy, when you represented the IS curve equation using the goods market equilibrium condition, this was simply y is equal to z, where z was c plus I plus g. But now it's y is equal to z, where z also includes net exports, right? So the open economy IS differs from the closed economy IS because now it includes net exports, which is the value of exports minus the value of imports, right? So this is the main difference when we're deriving the IS curve for an open economy. Now, when we define aggregate demand, I demand for domestically produced goods and services. So now that will include net exports. So the open economy IS differs from the closed economy IS because it includes net exports. Now, the certain assumptions that we're going to make. The first assumption is we're going to assume the Marshall-Lerner condition holds. Recall the Marshall-Lerner condition says that the real depreciation leads to an increase in net exports. This was already discussed in chapter 19, that that when you have a real depreciation appreciation, it has an ambiguous effect on net exports. But we'll assume the Marshall-Lerner condition holds, which says that the real depreciation leads to an increase in net exports. The second assumption we'll make is we're going to assume the domestic price level P is constant. If that is constant, this means in domestic inflation and domestic expected inflation are zero. What this will allow us to do is this will allow us to set real interest rate equal to nominal interest rate. Because remember, real interest rate is nominal interest rate minus expected inflation. Because we're assuming the domestic price level P is constant, then expected inflation is zero. So then R is just equal to I. This is the first simplification this will allow us to do. Third assumption we're making is that the foreign price level is also constant, right? P is the domestic price level, P star is the foreign price level. And then we're going to just set P star is equal to P is equal to 1. So we're assuming that the domestic and foreign price level are constant and equal to 1. Now, what this will imply is that, because remember, the real exchange rate is the nominal exchange rate into domestic price level divided by foreign price level. So we're just setting P is equal to P star is equal to 1. This implies that the real exchange rate is equal to the nominal exchange rate. So basically, we're assuming three things. We're assuming the Marshall-Lerner condition holds. We assume the domestic price level is constant, which means expected inflation is zero, such that R is equal to I. Then we assume the foreign price level is constant and is equal to the domestic price level, which implies that the nominal exchange rate is equal to the real exchange rate. So what we can do using this is, now let's go back to IS curve equation. We know investment depends upon real interest rate, but because of the assumption that we made, real interest rate is the same as nominal interest rate. We know net exports depend upon real exchange rate, but given the assumption that we made, the real exchange rate is the same as the nominal exchange rate. So the assumptions that we have made, they allow us to replace the real interest rate in the IS equation by the nominal interest rate, and they allow us to replace the real exchange rate in the net export function using the nominal exchange rate. So with these simplifications, our IS equation using nominal rate simply becomes, in general, investment is a function of real interest rate. But given the assumption that we made, R is just equal to I, so we can write it in terms of, so we can write investment as a function of nominal interest rate. Similarly, we know that net exports is a function of real exchange rate, but now we can write it as a function of nominal exchange rate given the assumption that we've made. Now, this is important because the uncovered interest parity condition depends upon the nominal exchange rate, the way we derived it in chapter 19. And then later we'll see that once we look at the third element of this model, which is the UIP, uncovered interest parity condition. So in that case, then we can replace this E with the UIP condition that we've derived in chapter 19. So now it's useful to highlight certain open economy aspects of the IS curve. The first is the IS curve is still downward sloping, right? It's still going to be downward sloping because when interest rate goes down, output increases. But in an open economy, this occurs through two channels. The first is the direct negative effect of interest rate on investment, which we have in both open and closed economy, where when we know, okay, interest rate goes down, investment goes up, demand goes up, output increases, right? So this reason existed for the IS curve being downward sloping in the closed economy as well, right? Where we said when interest rate changes, investment changes, demand output changes. But now in an open economy, we have an additional indirect effect of the interest rate through the exchange rate on net exports. Because when interest rate goes down, E, which represents both the real and the nominal exchange rate in this case, given the assumptions that we made, if we go back to them quickly. So the given assumptions we have made, real exchange rate is equal to nominal exchange rate, right? So when domestic interest rate goes down, your exchange rate goes down from the UIP, right? This is the UIP that we derived in chapter 19. We just solved it for E, right? Your nominal exchange rate. So when from the UIP condition, you can see when the interest rate goes down, the exchange rate goes down. And when exchange rate goes down, then the net exports increase, assuming the Marshall-Erner condition is satisfied, which we are assuming is. So when net exports go up, we know demand for domestic goods goes up, because remember, Z now is made up of C plus I plus G plus NX, right? So when net exports increase, it's one of the components of demand. Demand goes up, so output goes up. So in an open economy, the IS curve is also downward sloping, but there are two reasons why it's downward sloping. One is the usual reason that we had in the closed economy as well, that when interest rate changes, investment changes, demand changes, and output changes. But now we have the additional effect through exchange rates on net exports. We will now our interest rate changes from the UIP. We can see our exchange rate changes, which assuming the Marshall-Erner condition is satisfied, changes our net exports. Net exports, just like investment, is a component of demand. So demand Z changes because Z is made up of both I and NX, right? So and C and G. So as a result of this, then output changes. The second aspect that you want to look at of the IS curve is that if we recall that when we discussed the IS curve in chapter 6, we said any factor that affects demands per domestic goods, i.e. aggregate demand Z, other than interest rate will cause shifts in the IS curve, right? So this is something that we've already discussed. IS curve shifts because of factors that will influence your aggregate demand, i.e. demand for domestically produced goods and services other than interest rate. Now, this will include the same exogenous variables from the closed economy version of the model, where we talk about changes in G, changes in autonomous consumption, changes in investment other than interest rate, like changes in business confidence and changes in taxes. So all of these factors will still, the same exogenous variables that we had in the closed economy version of the model will still shift the IS curve. But now there are additional factors we can shift the IS curve, which would include changes in net exports other than interest rate, right? Because like you said, IS curve shifts because of any factor that affects aggregate demand other than interest rate. You still have the same exogenous variables from the closed economy version of the model, but now there are additional factors that can shift the IS curve, which are those factors that affect net exports other than interest rate, other than domestic interest rate. Now, this may be because of change in foreign income, because when foreign income changes, we know exports change, that's going to change net exports, right? And this is going to cause net exports to change for reasons other than the domestic interest rate, right? Changes in foreign interest rate, because when foreign interest rate changes, again from the UIP condition, UIP, let's recall when I star changes, that's going to cause E to change, right, from the UIP or exchange rate. And when your exchange rate changes, as a result of this, your net exports will change, right? Assuming Marshall-Erner condition holds. Assuming the Marshall-Erner condition is satisfied, that's going to change net exports. Again, this is an assumption that we're making, that the Marshall-Erner condition is satisfied. So ML condition, we mean the Marshall-Erner condition. Then you can also have expected future exchange rate, because when expected future exchange rate changes, again from UIP, we know from UIP, we know when expected future exchange rate changes, that's going to change your exchange rate. As a result of this, net exports will change, assuming Marshall-Erner condition is satisfied, right? And we know a change in net exports because of a change in domestic interest rate will only cause movement in IS. So this is similar to how when we discussed given investment changes due to changes in interest rate, it's only a movement. If investment changes due to other exogenous factors like changes in business confidence, that causes a shift. So it's important to keep in mind in an open economy, the IS curve is still downward sloping, but now the effect of interest rate on output happens through two channels. One is through the usual effect of interest rate on investment, which we had in a closed economy as well, but now there's an additional indirect effect through exchange rates on net exports. And secondly, we know any factor that affects aggregate demand, i.e. demand for domestically produced goods and services, other than interest rate, shifts the IS curve. You still have the same exogenous variables as in the closed economy version of the model, but now IS curve will also shift because of any factor that affects net exports other than domestic interest rate.